Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Please do have a seat. There's room. We are very, very privileged to have Anne Bernstein to present us here a research on democratic alternatives from the South, from the perspective of India, Brazil, and South Africa. Anne is founder and executive director of the Center of Development and Enterprise in Johannesburg, South Africa. The CDE is one of the country's leading think tanks on social and economic policy issues, so we are colleagues on that regard, and we feel very privileged to have you here. Her latest book is The Case for Business in Developing Economies, and the book received the Sir Anthony Fisher International Memorial Award from the Atlas Economic Research Foundation in Washington, D.C. She was invited faculty member at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2008 and 2009, and is on the board of the Bern Trust Foundation, and was member of the board of the Development Bank of South Africa between 1995 and 2001. In 2005 and 2006, she was a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, and in 2013, a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington. And looking at your resume and what the CDE does, we could see that it's not the think tank. We have an emphatic view of how our countries should change and how to address our different challenges. And I'm also very happy to have here the founding father of this institution, Roberto Newell, as commentator of the paper. I think everybody knows Roberto here in the room. Most of us have worked for him, so we do know him. And we are very happy, and it's also a privilege to welcome back here, Roberto. We're going to proceed like a 20-minute introduction by Anne, and then to have a more dynamic conversation with all of us doing questions and answers about it. Thank you very much, Anne, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with the two most important people in your institution. So it's great to be here in such a wonderful audience. I'm going to very quickly summarize some 15 research papers, 3 workshops in India, Brazil, and South Africa, and give you a feel, a sort of trailer of what's in our report, which a few copies of which are outside. So the center that I run is an independent think tank. We're funded by about 20 companies. Very large companies give us very small amounts of money. And then we get project money wherever we can from international foundations and so on. So I feel very at home in this institution. It feels very familiar, and thank you for that. A few years ago, we started saying that our key focus is on South Africa and reforming South Africa and helping to consolidate our new democracy and make sure we're a success for all the citizens. But we felt that we didn't know enough about other developing country democracies. Now, our government had joined BRICS, which includes China, Russia, India, Brazil. But we're not so keen on non-democratic societies. We're an organization that believes in democracy, warts and all. And we thought there's so much attention being paid to China. And if you think of 2008, the financial crisis, Western democratic capitalism had been knocked off its pedestal. At the same time, China looked robust, going places, doing very well. And did it really matter about human rights, and it was an authoritarian state? And we said, well, we do think it matters. Let's turn the spotlight to the democratic developing countries. We don't really have a language for all of this anymore. And see how they're doing. Is there a democratic developing countries that actually delivers? So this was the paragraph that enabled us to raise quite a lot of money. And we then started on a journey of, in India, Brazil, and South Africa, we commissioned papers from leading experts in each country on the same topic. We looked at corruption as is this an area where democracies have an advantage, not in the sense that they have less or more, but that they can fight it more effectively with the mechanisms of democracy. We looked at economic growth, we looked at poverty alleviation, and then we looked at innovation. Do democracies have advantages here, or is it neutral, or is it irrelevant? So coming out of all of this, I'm going to really sort of talk a bit on democracy and development. Now you might say, why does it matter, all this talk about democracy? We think it matters a lot if you believe in human rights and freedoms, and if you believe in democracy in a market economy. I think we live in a global context now, which you might say there is a heightened battle of ideas. China's success has not made everybody want to emulate that model, whatever it might be, but it has certainly legitimized non-democratic approaches to development. We have the president of Hungary giving a proud speech in favor of illiberal democracy recently. You go to Nairobi, where we were a few months ago, and everyone I met told me how they are engaged in constant discussions on the authoritarian approach or the democratic approach. Ethiopia, the president sort of is democracy. I'm not interested in democracy. Too many meetings. I'm just going to do things. I know what is right for my country. And in South Africa, we are a democracy, but there is a lot of attraction among the ruling elite to the Chinese model, whatever they mean by that. So there is a global battle of ideas going on, and we think that matters. Why did we pick the three countries? Well, we had limited resources, and it seemed that India, Brazil, and South Africa are three obviously very different countries. But they had similar kinds of challenges. They're all very important in their continents or regions, and they were part of this government grouping. So hasn't done very much, in my opinion, but India, Brazil, and South Africa, the governments had got together. So what does our report say? What are our key findings? Over the last 25, 30 years, what have these three countries achieved? What have these three democracies achieved? And when you look at it, it's actually quite a lot. A range of areas where they have moved people out of poverty. About 200 million people have been moved out of poverty in India. The Brazilians have moved 40 million people out of a population of just under 200 into the lower middle class. They have reduced poverty. They have started in a very unequal society to reduce inequality. South Africa, certainly not done as well as many of us hoped, but nonetheless, in the 20-year period, has provided services to millions of people who never had these before, from running water to sewage to electricity to a whole lot of things. Has started to reduce poverty, not as much as in the other countries, and all three have built and consolidated democratic institutions, which matter. Some stronger than others, but these are countries with free presses, with independent judiciaries, with a whole lot of the democratic institutions that are so vital, and they have world-class elections. They're not perfect, but the MPs are, and they're pretty impressive. So numerous times you have world-class elections, and of course India is this great miracle of a democratic society involving 1.2 billion people of very diverse religions, groups, regions. It's a continent that is democratic. So we emphasize the achievements because many people in those countries tend to take them for granted, and we think that's a mistake. They tend to also think there's so much more to do, we haven't done nearly enough, which is true, but it doesn't mean you should ignore what has been achieved. You look at Brazil, for example, we were really struck, not so much that corruption exists, it exists in almost every country. In authoritarian states, it's a big black box. You're only allowed to see what the ruler might want you to see, when they want you to see it. In democracies, you're seeing a lot more of the corruption because of greater transparency and accountability. And all three countries have developed institutions to fight corruption. I think Brazil is the most successful. If you think of the, it's called the big monthly, the Mensualo scandal, which came right next to President Lula. And every time you went to Brazil, they said, oh, they'll never put all these politically well-connected people in jail. This won't happen. It's just talk. Well, some 25 people very, very close to the president, the head of his party, the head of the financial system, his chief whip in Congress. I mean, everybody you can imagine, they put them in jail. We're now seeing a similar series of incidents in Brazil, where the independent judiciary is taking on the highest people in the land, including President Lula, very close now. The question is whether they'll vote for the current president as well. But this is possible through democratic institutions. So democracies are about much more than just elections. Elections are important. You've got to throw the rascals out at regular intervals. But much more is at stake. So a lot of attention to the achievements, and then we look at what are the advantages of democracy, and we look at fighting corruption as one of them. I like the example of a website that was started in India called IPaidAbribe.com, where if you were forced to pay a bribe in order to get some basic service, which is your right, you could go and report it on a website, anonymously or not. Anyhow, this has had quite some impact in different parts of the Indian bureaucracy. Some Chinese activists wanted to start a similar thing, well, it was closed down within a few weeks, not allowed. So democracies have advantages when it comes to fighting corruption. The third big area we looked at was, well, where are these countries now? They've achieved all sorts of things, where are they now? And it was surprising how similar the situations were. They all had assumed that higher growth, which came from macroeconomic reforms some 25 years ago, where democratic governments introduced significant economic reform. They got results from that. Then they got lazy. They thought higher growth was the new normal. Why keep reforming? It's too painful. Actually, we can be more generous. We can hand out more money. And things started to slide, and then the economic crunch came in 2008. In all three countries, it took a while to play out, but they're all facing very big and very similar challenges, whether it's their appalling education system, where people go to education now, but what they're actually taught is very, very little. For the vast majority of the population, to their inability to deliver infrastructure on time, on price, if at all, to a range of other areas, such as very complex and rigid labor regulations, which prevent low-skill manufacturing and much more labor-intensive economies, more formal economies, very similar across all three. So all three countries face a whole range of challenges, and that we concluded, it's about 18 months ago, we concluded that all three countries were in dangerous waters. They had to reform to consolidate what they had achieved. They had to make sure they didn't slip in terms of the reforms they'd already made, whether economic or democratic, and they had to go much further. And we spelled out the areas in which they needed to make reforms, which were essentially we were saying that each country had to go for a bold reform package, not low-key, not incremental. They need bold reforms. It's easy to say what the reforms should be. It's much more important to think about the politics of reform, which, from what little I understand, is relevant to Mexico now. And we thought a lot about the politics of reform across these three countries. And it seemed to us that you have to, as a democracy, build on the advantages democracy provides in order to build reform coalitions. You have to move quite fast and build new interests that see advantages in the reform process. So they help to bolster you against the vested interests who like the status quo. In all three countries, there needed to be a much more assertive commitment and understanding about the relationship between markets and democracy. It's not just democracy that delivers, it's markets and democracy. In all three countries, capitalism and business, whatever words you use in your society, have been undersold. Companies and the chief executives are appalling at selling the good that they do, not corporate social responsibility, not schools and the cherry on top, but just running successful modern businesses has enormous positive impact on a society, but that has to be communicated much more effectively by politicians, by companies, and others. And this matters in countries like the three we've looked at with our complicated histories and divided histories and the role of business in the past. And then the third issue on the politics of reform is that, in a sense, the first wave of macroeconomic reforms did benefit everyone, but it was perceived as benefiting the fat cats more than everybody. And that differs from place to place, but that was important, that in a second wave of reform, this issue was understood and thought about and communicated much more clearly, and reforms adopted that brought more of the excluded into the modern economy and opportunities. So let me pull this together and conclude. It would be nice to argue that democracy is essential for growth and development, but empirically that's false. There are authoritarian states that have delivered, many have not. Many end in bloodshed and tears, but there are a few that have delivered. So you can't say you have to be democratic if you're going to deliver on growth and inclusion for everybody in a society. But we would argue that you can have growth, development and inclusion, and human rights and freedoms. The evidence from three important countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, is in our view compelling and a resounding yes to the question of can you have both. It's not democracy that holds these three countries back. It's bad policy decisions. It's a failure to fully embrace markets and the private sector. It's a failure to sell the benefits of competitive markets, not crony capitalism, competitive markets to the general public and voters. And it's weak institutions that succumb to corruption and crony capitalism. All these things hold democratic developing countries back, and ultimately it's a failure of leadership, political, economic, and other in a society. So in large, complex developing countries, vested interests pursue the status quo. But we think that democratic politicians and leaders can build new coalitions for reform and use the many mechanisms of democratic values and institutions to change the definition of what's in the national interest. Of course, there are no guarantees, but we believe that these three countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, can introduce a second wave of reforms. India is, of course, ahead of the game, and I'm optimistic about the possibilities of the Modi government. I have a feeling that the crisis in Brazil is going to lead to, well, she's handed over economic policy to a very firm market-oriented person, and it's quite possible the crisis could lead to a much greater commitment to market reforms and greater transparency and a strengthening of democratic institutions such as the judiciary. South Africa is, like Brazil, in a bad way at the moment, and we could talk more about that, but it might be that in crisis there will be opportunity in South Africa as well. It's important to remember that after all, in response to economic crisis some 25, 30 years ago, in each of these countries, democratic governments did introduce reforms, and they stuck with them and they got results. So they have done it before. It's not utopian to think that they can do it now. If they do move in the reform direction successfully, we would argue that the emerging democratic market-based alternatives from the South will be strengthened in these three cases. Of course, none of these countries offer a blueprint, and nonetheless, they do offer important lessons and insights for other developing countries, and that's what we hope to talk about today. The Mexican, does this resonate with you? Do you agree or disagree with us? So there is a democratic alternative emerging from the South, in our view. These three countries embody it and are three of the pivotal countries to watch. Of course, Mexico is another one. Indonesia is another very important country in this context. But I would end with, it's important to remember these multi-ethnic, complex societies have held together and built democratic institutions. They need to go further, but they have been able to do it. And that's what I hope we can discuss today. Thanks very much.
After listening to you, and I know you leave on Thursday, I was wondering if you could stay a couple of years more. Because we need your ideas, we need your arguments, and Mexico needs the evidence you're putting forward, because we are really sharing a struggle. And let's just pass the word to Roberto.
I'm almost willing to bet that I'm the only person in the room that's read the full paper. Let's see. Though not all of the essays that the full paper were based on. And I can understand why it was so easily readable. And that's because you are very, very compelling to communicate. Congratulations. The underlying question, the common thread that the authors of this paper are trying to get their hands on is, can democracies compete successfully with authoritarian governments in delivering the goodies to a society on a reliable basis and in a durable way? Or are they inherently disadvantaged in the competition with, say, an authoritarian government such as has provided, such as was the case of China, or if we go back in history, such as was the case, for instance, of Germany during the 19th century, which was able to very rapidly industrialize, become a leading economic player on the strength of authoritarian government, which only much later developed democratic institutions. And this question has been haunting people like us, I include everybody in this room, who've been dealing with the issue of what is the right sequence of institution building and economic development, and in what order should you try to make things happen if you are trying to deliver a society that is functional and works for everybody. It's certainly not the first time that this issue has been addressed, nor will it be the last. And frankly, I think that the piece that I was asked to read and comment does a very credible job of addressing the common threat in three countries that are dealing with the challenges of being both forced to modernize rapidly in order to be able to deliver goodies to their societies, and to do so in the messy environment that democratic institutions tend to generate. And this is very, very germane to the Mexican case. I would remind you, and I'm of the age so that I lived it, that Mexico first modernized its institutions and then became a democracy. Most of the important institution building processes of Mexico started in the early 30s and grew and developed pari passu with the regime ran in this country. To this day, we live fundamentally on the capital, the institutional capital that was built by the PRI, and the PRI was everything but a democratic party. This was called by Vargas Llosa the perfect dictatorship, in that it was relatively gentle in the way it dictated, but it was an autocratic regime without a doubt, and one that imposed its will every time that it needed to, and was willing to kill to make its preferences felt. In fact, the last significant wave of reforms of Mexico happened during the Salinas administration. That was the last of the strong PRI presidents back in the 90s. It is impossible to imagine Mexico today without that wave of reforms. It's doubtful that we would have been able to enact that wave of reforms today, given the political competition that we have in the Mexican political system. And lamentably, this would seem to argue that Mexico's economic growth and those things that it has done well to provide itself with modern institutions happened in the absence of democracy. And I say lamentably because I, as you know, am truly convinced liberal. I don't think democracy is any less important than strong economic performance. In fact, I would not want to live in a society that didn't provide me and those that I love with a set of rights and privileges that attain to citizens who are fully in the exercise of their life. It was only very recently been able to provide us some sense of those liberties, and most of my life happened in a different kind of Mexico, a Mexico that didn't give us those rights. Francis Fukuyama has recently written a very, very powerful book in which he really addresses the issue of what is the likeliest way to develop a society that is successful in delivering both modern markets and durable institutions. And he addresses the development of the United States and several European nations and tries to answer the question, did they succeed because they first became democracies and then built democratic institutions that then enabled economic growth to happen? Or was the sequence different? And what seems to be the same, the best path? And interestingly, he doesn't come to a very clear conclusion. His conclusion is there are several paths to sustainable growth and development. Many, for instance, built very, very strong institutions first, and only after that did it bother to develop an economy, and only after that did it bother to provide individual rights to its citizens. So its sequence was institution building first, particularly around very strong legal system. Secondly, the development of property rights, on the back of the property rights, the development of a strong industrial economy. And only after that, and actually only after they'd been defeated in 2 world wars, or perhaps one very long-lasting world war, the development of a true plural democracy. The United States was exactly the sloppy opposite. It started off with a very early form of democracy. On the strength of that, started to build a thriving set of economic principles, basically built on the private property. And on the strength of that, then did some of the institution building that enabled it to defeat trusts, to enable a set of rights to individuals that would otherwise have been trampled. And both of these paths seem to lead to relatively successful and thriving democracies in the late 20th century, early 21st century. And so the process does not seem to be very clear. Which of the two advantages, which of the two processes we should want to advantage does not seem to have a clear answer. But what seems very, very clear is that you cannot have a sustainable economy and a sustainable democracy without building strong institutions. And as I was talking to Anne in preparation of this discussion, I said, geez, maybe one of the things that relevant economists such as me have got to spend more time is coming together with the issue of how do we build durable institutions? What is the blueprint for these durable institutions? Is there any way that we can imprint new democracies and new capital economies, capitalist economies with a DNA for those institutions that make it likely that the economy and the democracy will continue to subsist together well. And the answer is, I don't know of such an institution building blueprint, but maybe that's where we need to spend a good deal of work, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, Anne. And by the way, I'd also like to introduce, if that's agreeable, and invite him to participate in the discussion too. You shouldn't just sit back there and look pretty. You should sit up here and look pretty with us, or look prettier than us. So Anne, why don't I throw this back to you, and then of course you're all invited to participate. This is a free for all, folks. This is INCO. Anne, start, please.
Yeah. Marco.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm Marco Fernandez from the School of Government at Tec de Monterrey. I'm from Mexico, Valua. I have several questions related to what you said. On the first hand, the role of inequality. The role of inequality. These three countries have important rates of inequality. South Africa, in fact, if I understand correctly, the most unequal country in Africa. And recently, precisely related to this question of inequality, there was an interview in Hard Talk in the BBC program to one of the ministers of South Africa, pointing out that there is the weaknesses of the institutions in South Africa because of this inequality, the challenge of moving forward further reforms when precisely because of the vested interests, taking advantage of this inequality, taking advantage of the role of money in politics, they use clientelism and other practices to try to undermine the possibility of these broader coalitions in favor of reform. Similar challenges are taking place in Brazil, for that matter, and in the case of India, it's also a very clientelistic country. The other question that I have is, how do you view this inclusive development environment when you have the challenge of ethnic divisions? Both in South Africa recently, unfortunately, we have seen high tensions toward migrants, where there have been this ethnic component has been very strong. The same happens in the case of India, and in the case of Brazil, precisely, they even have to move for affirmative action kind of policies in the school systems for the blacks. So I would like to if you could share with us your thoughts in precisely retaking Roberto's question. How do you build in this kind of environment the strong institutions where vested interests have not any interest to build strong institutions, inclusive institutions in the terms of Asamoah and Robinson and those guys? I mean, how do you overcome this situation?
Yeah, you want maybe Mauricio?
Yeah.
Well, let me respond first on South Africa and then institutions and the questions that both of you are raising in different ways. I'm a great believer that I think poverty matters a great deal more than inequality. Doesn't mean inequality is not important. I think excessive inequality is a problem. But I'm much more interested in how we move people out of poverty and empower them to then make their own lives and make their own opportunities. And I think that's very important. One of the big failures of South Africa, democratic South Africa, over the last 20 years, is that they have failed to improve education. Now, any government minister who wants to come and talk about inequality or black economic empowerment, I would say you're a hypocrite because you haven't dealt with education. And I think that is a matter of standing up to the trade unions. There are other issues, but that is the key issue of performance and accountability, as I understand, is similar here. So I don't think it's a matter of weakness of institutions. I think it's a question of failure of leadership. So I am a great believer in political leadership matters. Institutional leadership matters. And that small groups of people and individuals can make an enormous difference. And I think we're seeing that in terms of possibility and some delivery in India. Not as much as everyone hopes, but I think you're seeing that. And you're also seeing it in some Indian states, where they're going ahead of the national reform agenda and starting to take action. And in general, you get a leader who is head of that state. So I think we shouldn't underestimate that and the importance of that. The story in South Africa is that in the last 6 years, we have had the ruling party has been taken over by a group of people who are much more interested in enriching themselves than in the national interest. And in that context, they are undermining all sorts of things. And then we have a president who's desperate to stay out of jail. And he will undermine any institution that we have built up around a democratic constitution to do that. But he's not able to do all of that because people are fighting back. And so this is where the country's at now. There is a tussle on, will the constitution win out, or how much more damage can this group of people do? I think there's more damage before it gets better. But I also think there are quite strong institutions fighting back in the society. So corruption is corrosive. And when it's right at the top, I think it's very problematic. I would also, let me just say something about affirmative action. This is a topic which I think there's a lot is talked about, this topic, positive interventions. Much less is talked about how it actually plays out in societies, who benefits. It's generally the top end of the discriminated against group who would probably have got those anyway. And in some respects, you make the poorer people more discriminated. They're further behind rather than being assisted. That certainly would be a reading of the American experience. And the South African experience has not been a success. It has fed the corruption, and it certainly has not enabled the very many people excluded from our formal economy and good schooling and all the opportunities the society can provide. It has not helped them. So it's helped the fat cats of the previously discriminated against group. So I feel very strongly about that. I think it's a terrible idea for Brazil. And I think in India it's a complex issue. It's so much bigger a society. But reservations now, not only for the original untouchables or the Dalits, many of whom are starting to do quite well in politics and in economics, not enough. But you have groups now competing to be known as other backward classes. It's a great ambition for a society. And almost the majority of jobs in the civil service are allocated to these groups rather than merit. I don't think you can run a modern society that way. So I'm quite strongly against a lot of that. Now, how do we get institutions? Let me just deal with the migrant issue in South Africa, and then I'll come to the institutional question. We just have an op-ed in South Africa's paper on Friday on this topic. In brief, I would say the following. South Africa has failed to manage migration effectively. We are the most advanced society in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're obviously a magnet for both refugees and economic migrants. All the experience, which you all know better than me in terms of America, all the experience is you have to manage migration in a sensible way. This is a complex challenge. The South African government has bungled this from beginning to end. And then if you think that we're getting quite a lot of fairly unskilled migrants coming into very poor communities where the state has failed to deliver the kind of low-level jobs that those people, through no fault of their own, are qualified to do, where we're seeing a situation where you can become very rich very quickly if you're connected, and a whole lot of other failures. In that context, the government has not managed migration policy. They allow completely exaggerated numbers, and they also perpetuate crazy numbers that bear no relationship to reality in terms of the numbers of migrants. And then they issue ambiguous statements where they say, oh, you mustn't kill migrants, but are these people really legal? So there have been some rogue statements by, in my view, the president and cabinet ministers. So they're ambiguous. I think this is a difficult situation. They failed to deal with it in 2008 when this really exploded. They failed, and the president said, oh, we didn't learn the lessons of 2008. Well, whose fault is that? Now we've had it in two very worrying sets of incidents in 2015. They have not managed this well at all. The so-called King of the Zulus, a tribal group who we pay an incredible amount of money, was allowed to make some outrageous comments. And it took some time to get him to backtrack and tell his public. So I think this has been very badly handled. Nothing inherent in South Africa. It's been badly handled at a number of levels. The refugee issue we completely mishandled. We pretend we're a very rich country, so we won't do what other developing countries do, and we don't have the capacity. We haven't built the capacity sufficient to deal with refugees quickly. So you can apply for refugee status, and then you hang around and you can work for a very long time. This feeds the sort of tensions. How do you build institutions in a democracy? Well, I think the way you do it in any society. And I'm not sure that whether you're authoritarian or democratic has a lot to do with that. I think it has to do, look at the Delhi metro. Here we are in the most rambunctious democracy the world has seen, chaotic and complicated. The man who built the Delhi metro said, this is how I'm going to do it, these are the rules, and he did it. A phenomenal achievement. It's a modern, fabulous metro. And actually, it's very interesting. He has a sign in this sort of achievement which says, if you've been to India, you'll know that you go into any building and there are just hundreds of people who don't have it, who sort of, their job is to sit around and open the door. And so he basically says, one of the philosophies of the Delhi Metro Corporation is nobody does that. We do not have jobs for hangers-on or all that sort of thing. So it was a very clear decision.
the country, and it seems it will stay there for some time. How long, I don't know. But there's also a lot of need for much more political participation and the creation of new parties. And there have been some attempts. And nevertheless, I don't see that there is sufficient progress in that respect. And I don't know to what extent that has to do also with this issue of corruption, which I find that certainly you just mentioned it. I mean, the new politicians arriving to power, and well, we know the whole story. The fat cats that's the situation. So, what would be your expectation on South Africa in the near future?
Well, so like most liberation movements, so-called, the African National Congress came back to South Africa, or sort of re-emerged in South Africa, and has swept the boards with elections, getting sort of impressive majorities in the 60s, 60% of the population up until now. What's interesting and hopeful about what's happening is the official opposition. So the first election, 1994, what has become the official opposition got less than 2% of the national vote. And this was a liberal democratic party, white dominated, that had opposed apartheid, but had not, if you like, supported. Well, today, 20 years later, they represent almost a quarter of the electorate, which is impressive growth. They claim to be the most multiracial political party in the country, and they run one province, one state in the country, one major metropolitan area, and a number of smaller municipalities. So the big question is, can they continue to grow? Now, if you think about it, took the Congress Party in India some 40, 45 years to lose power. In South Africa, we're 20 years on. The local government elections next year are going to be very interesting. In the cities, the ANC is losing support. They are starting to lose the black middle class support, not all, and they're starting to lose almost sort of legitimacy in some urban areas. Will this deliver some additional cities to the opposition next year? Now, corruption is a factor. The ANC as a political party has, in the words of their own Secretary General, they are now a kind of dealership. You join the party in order to get a position and get rich. Not only becoming a city, sort of local government councillor or the next level, or in a member of parliament, because that's the best salary you have ever had, but also because you get the power to dispense patronage and you can benefit from that.
Very similar.
So, but the question is, who's left out? So if you're in and you're connected, great, you want to get as much as possible, as quickly as possible. But in South Africa, what seems to be happening is that more and more groups in the black middle class are not getting part of this. Because we have a vibrant private sector, there is an alternative. You don't have to go into the public sector. You can go into a more merit-based private sector. So we have people who've come up through the ranks in the private sector who believe in merit and who understand what is going on. I think at one level you have to say, well, the elite that's connected is very greedy, and it's all the other people who are not getting part of the spoils who are growing in number. So that's one of the hopeful things about the country. So I think political party development in developing countries and probably in rich countries is a very important issue. And the way it works is, I think one of the learnings for me in Brazil and India is how weak the political parties are in those countries, and that this is a very important area for development. South Africa has always been a bit different, and it remains to be seen if the official opposition can continue to grow. There have been some other breakaway parties. Most have started and then fallen apart through pathetic leadership. There's one now which is a more populist offshoot, which is, I think, it's not clear if it's going to implode or going to continuing. It's a mixture of both. It's a populist grouping. It's kind of positions itself to the left of the ANC. It's deeply corrupt. Its leader is deeply corrupt. But on the other hand, it's very useful having increasingly loud black voices saying the emperor has no clothes. So this is expanding the pace for political debate in the country, irrespective of race, and that's very important.
As a suspicious signal, we have Mr. Jacob Zuma and Mr. Dilma who said there on the board. Roberto and Rodrigo.
Just a quick commentary and reflection. I like your call for leaders to step up and lead, because I do think without leaders it's a lot harder to affect change. But in the absence of strong rules-based institutions in a democracy, it's not at all difficult to have those leaders become demagogues, and for those demagogues to lead in ways that are very, very dangerous to the well-being of democratic societies. And we don't have to go very far in this continent to find such examples. One of the tragedies of Latin America is what's happening in Venezuela. And it could easily happen elsewhere because we have several societies where we have thriving democracies but very weak institutions. And when rules are not clear and there is no enforcement mechanism, it's terribly easy for adhocracy to take over and for these leaders to invent rules that perpetuate themselves. I frankly think we already have a demagogue in our midst. I think he's very dangerous. I think we are in exactly that sort of institutional weakness that I found in Venezuela when I worked there many years ago, which led to Chavez. It's not at all unlike what's happened in Argentina. It could happen in several other countries, including Brazil, including, I'm afraid, South Africa, where you know that case better. And for that matter, we really have to yet find whether Mr. Modi is a true convinced Democrat or whether he's a Democrat in wolves, in clothes of a sheep. No, it's not clear that Mr. Modi is a truly convinced Democrat. We have to be really careful. These things that we call democracies are very brittle, very, very delicate. And leaders, in the absence of strong can often turn into demagogues. Germany certainly went that way. Russia certainly went that way. China has gone that way. That is the threat in the case of China in the future. I would cross my fingers and say, let's be really careful that we don't look for that inspirational leader who takes our societies exactly in the worst way and creates monstrous outcomes.
Let me respond to that, because I agree with you, and you raised some very important questions. I think a lot of the passion for democracy we've seen in the sort of ritual over the last 20, 30 years. I think of Carter Center, or people sending, a lot of money's gone into election monitoring. Now, elections are important, don't get me wrong, but they're only one part of democracy. Democracy is about the rules of the game. It's about the rule of law. It's about freedom of the press. It's about the freedom to organize, about the accountability, etc. So these things really matter. And I think people who prioritize elections over the other things are wrong. And in a way, I think unwittingly, they've helped to say, well, you have a more or less free election, and that's okay. And we know, and this Latin America certainly knows a lot better than we understand how wrong that can be. So I absolutely agree with you. And I think one of the issues is we should talk about democracy in its fullest sense and not overemphasize elections, which are vitally important. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is, within that, leadership has to be constrained. So leadership matters, but it has to be democratic leadership. So I'm not advocating sort of leadership cults or, you know, Mr. Mandela had a number of faults. I think the way the world went on and on and on about him had some negatives for South Africa as well as positives. He was a remarkable man, but you know, not a candidate for sainthood. And that's part of what we need to talk through as well. So I think people who believe in democracy, we're under threat. There is no doubt about it. There is a great battle going on globally and within countries, and that means we shouldn't be complacent. And crisis can lead to opportunities for Democrats, but also for less appealing characters, and you need to be aware of that. I've been saying a lot in South Africa, there's a lot of gloom about South Africa in many quarters. Until we get rid of the current bunch, how are we going to affect anything? And the natural instinct is for people to retreat, to move out of public life. But actually countries in crisis, they need more active, involved citizens because the other side is organizing. So I agree with you about all of that. And I think this is a time for Democrats and people who believe in democratic capitalism in a competitive market sense, not a crony capitalist sense. We have to be vigilant and organized and understand the dangers. They're real. And part of this is talking a lot more about good political party development, what this means in a democracy, and that leads you to think about funding and a whole lot of complicated issues. It requires protecting the independent institutions we have. I think democracy does not mean everybody's got to vote about everything. I believe in representative democracy and in protecting the independence of certain institutions, almost away from mass kind of voting and pressures. So that's important, and one has to think that through in a particular society. And I think that often you get people who might come through elections. You know, famous saying in South Africa when I was growing up is, oh, you might be in favor of one man, one vote, but it could be one man, one vote once. It hasn't turned out that way in South Africa, but I guarantee it doesn't become like that and in other societies. So democracy is a work in progress, and you have to keep moving and you have to keep fighting for the values that underpin those sorts of societies and get more effective at that. You can't be complacent.
I want to ask you to elaborate a little more on particularly that issue, because paraphrasing a little Fernando Soto, the most important right of all the rights is property right for him. And all the human contract ends there, starts there. In a country like us, where 80% of the land has dubious property rights, and there is no way of making that asset fungible, or it puts into doubt most of bold economic reforms, including the energy reform. And I mean, you could go on and on with rural reform, poverty alleviation. You can go on and on in many topics. So I mean, understanding the differences in rule of law from Roman to common law, and especially in these three countries or others you've analyzed, what would you say? Because for me, that's a little, in the end, we're all equal for and against the law in the judiciary system. I mean, that's where, if we disagree on something, that's where we'll end. One kind of some sort of court or judicial system. And if that's not the blueprint for a democracy, then for me it's a little where is it? I understand there's many, but I think that's one of the things that holds together more the Anglo-Saxon societies into fairer democracies than other. But that's just my thought. So I just wanted to explore that.
Look, I think Hernando de Soto is right in that his argument about hidden capital in poorer communities and the importance of property rights. I'm not sure it's as important as he claims. So I'm in favor of what he's saying. I think the enforcement of the rule of law is absolutely fundamental to a society, and you can have parts of the rule of law in an authoritarian state, but it will be much more effective in a democratic state. I'm a big advocate of the rule of law, which means you have to have an independent judiciary to enforce it, and you need an effective policing system and a judicial mechanism. So it's not like, say, in India, it takes forever, 30 years to get your case through. That doesn't really work. So there's a whole complex of issues around making the rule of law work and be meaningful for rich and poor, as much as, not quite exactly alike, it's not going to happen, but as much as you can. I think that really matters. I think property rights is vital, and in most of these societies, you have issues about communal rights or tribal land from the past, which are hard for governments to deal with, but again, I'm in favor of dealing with them. You have to think through how to modernize without disadvantaging poorer people even more. So I'm in favor of that, and we would certainly be advocating that in South Africa. I think property rights in cities are very important as well. I don't think you should make a fetish of property rights. In other words, very important, and enforcing contract is very important, and nobody should be able to take my property arbitrarily. Whether it's leasehold, for example, South Africa, we're growing a big rental market for poorer people in the backyards of our older townships for Black South Africans. Is this good or bad? Well, the government sort of tries to ignore it. I think this is housing for very poor people who want to move and who are not yet ready to commit to the city or don't yet have a formal job where they have enough money to have their own place, ownership. So I'm not opposed to rental. I think one has to look at a mix of things in the cities for poorer people. So I think there are a range of issues here, and yes, the more you can get poorer, new middle class people thinking about ownership and the benefits of real ownership, that's important, but you don't want it to become an obstacle to their mobility out. So you need to think it through quite carefully, certainly in South Africa, which I understand that issue better than I would here.
I have a couple of questions. One is sort of, I guess one covers from the other. The first question is, to what extent do you notice an exhaustion of democracy in the three countries that you saw?
An exhaustion.
Yeah, an exhaustion. Because it's my sense that sort of democracy said oversold and underperformed. Right, and so now in countries that have embraced sort of democracy, Eastern included, Mexico was another one, you're kind of noticing sort of an impatience, sort of like where the results, growth has happened, but perhaps not at the rate that we expected, and especially human rights provisions have been slow to come along. So I think people are exhausted, or feel like that the model is exhausted, and that's why the threat of authoritarian regimes is perhaps so strong. So the next question is, proponents now have to sort of confront this idea, we can't oversell it again, because if we oversell it again, then 20 years from now, the competition will say, see, we've been telling you it doesn't work. So especially now that you have shortening attention spans and more patience, and people are expecting better and quicker results. So how do you convey a message that democracy is valuable, but that's also nuanced in a way that is not overselling? So how do you say something that's compelling and convincing without promising too much?
This is a really interesting issue. I think you have to distinguish, well, I don't claim to know, I think I understand Brazil a little and India a little and South Africa a lot. I think this debate in rich countries is being put forward as democracies exhausted. I don't buy this for those three countries. So I would argue that democracy is being re-energized in India. So there was a high percentage of people who voted in the Modi general election, and it was a new kind of election and involved lots of people. And you've had great enthusiasm in the Delhi election, where they said, oh, Modi's getting too arrogant, we won't vote for him, they'll give him a lesson recently. You've had enormous enthusiasm in state elections, so I don't buy that argument for India. I think for Brazil, I don't think I think the issue is different in Brazil. So when the Financial Times says, oh, 1 million people are protesting in Brazil, this is the stability of the state, I say, no, this is a very big country, 200 million people, 1 million people out on the streets. Well, nothing. These are people exercising their rights, and this is voice. And I'm in favor of that. Get used to it. I don't think, and there haven't been reports of people saying we're sick of democracy. They want more democracy. They want more transparency. They want more accountability. They're not saying, oh, we don't want all of this. So I think one's got to be very careful on how you interpret protests and things like that. Often it's good. And most of the protests in Brazil were peaceful. There was some anarchists and whatever, but so and certainly in South Africa, we're not seeing, oh, you haven't delivered enough, therefore I'm sick of democracy. You're not seeing that at all. I think you're seeing a reinvigoration of democracy with, say, this new populist party. They're a very odd mixture. They're quoting the Constitution, and they're getting everyone, you must read the Constitution, the president is not obeying the Constitution. So in some ways, they're affirming democracy in our founding document. So I question your premise of the argument. I don't think that's what's happening in those three countries. I'm sure democracy, I'm not a, how should I put it? I don't think democracy is the be-all and end-all of everything. I'm with Bagwadi, who said quite a long time ago, it's democracy and markets. So democracies have to deliver. If they don't deliver, they're under threat. And that's why we ended up with it so important that these countries reform. They have to continue delivering and more at a greater rate. So I think democracies do come under threat if there is a lack of delivery to vast numbers of people, and if there is inherent unfairness. One of the instructive things for me, when South Africa became a democracy, there was lots of talk, lots of chat about the learned intellectuals on, oh, you've got to deliver very fast, and people really want a lot, and then they're going to, if you're not careful, they're going to come and take your house and your swimming pool, sort of thing, to the rich. Well, when somebody went out and actually did some surveys of real poor people and asked them, what are your expectations? What are you looking forward to? The responses were incredibly moderate. There were things like, oh, we really need a tap at the end of our road so I don't have to walk for an hour. We want sewage systems that are, more sort of modern.
Running water.
They want running water, so they don't have to, so the kind of what ordinary people's expectations were incredibly realistic. They weren't crazy, and I don't think that's changed a lot. We're not getting people saying, oh, I want a BMW like the president, or got 6 or whatever. They're saying, I've been waiting, a man said to me, I've been on the housing list, the housing waiting list for 10 years now, but the president spends $25 million on his house. Why don't I have a house? Very realistic, and we could deliver. We could deliver to these people. So I think one's got to be very careful about gross generalizations. I think facts matter. So I think we've got to go out and talk to people a lot more before we make big statements. And certainly of these three countries, I would reject the premise of their democracy is exhausted. Agree with you, we shouldn't oversell it.
What is the role of religion in this context, thinking especially in the Middle East, Islamic movements, and political thinking?
Well, I don't know anything about what the Indians delightfully call West Asia, rather than, I think I'm adopting now. That's not my area of expertise, but if you look at religion, religion is obviously important in India. One of the fears about Modi, although there are fears and the facts are few and far between, and 25 commissions of different levels of government have looked into what happened in Gujarat, where there was Hindu-Muslim riots, really, and massacres on both sides, and terrible violence, and not found anything to hold against him. So India, this is a big issue. They have the largest Muslim population in the world, and they have Pakistan on their border, and this is complicated. What they will say to you is democracy has been a vital mechanism to and maybe another more traditional Christian as well. It's surprising that a Christian democratic party hasn't done much better in South Africa. Are they just useless politicians, or what is it? We have a very small one, but it keeps losing support, the African Christian Democratic Party. We did a big study a few years ago looking at the growth of evangelical Protestantism in South Africa, a topic on which I was extremely uninformed and skeptical. And we said, well, what does this mean for political and economic development in the country? And I must say, it changed my understanding of what we mean by civil society. Most people talk of civil society and they tend to be secular elite. They don't include religious organizations. We should. There are sort of many grassroots religious organizations in South Africa and Brazil. This is a global phenomenon. People are learning to read. They're reading the Bible, they're learning to read. That's very important. They're also encouraging a degree of entrepreneurship in the South African population, which very interesting. So it's a very interesting topic. It's not part of the mainstream political debate in the country at all, and certainly not in Brazil either, from what we've been able to understand. So I would say that religion is a much bigger issue in India. So, it's a much less of an issue in the two other countries that we know.
Well, first of all, thanks for coming here and sharing those really interesting insights in countries where usually similar at what's also really different. My question is regarding the statement you said before, that democracy is not conclusive that it's the best or the only way to achieve kind of growth and prosperity for a country.
No.
And then you have the case of Singapore, of course. So I was wondering, I mean, we as social scientists are interested in finding conclusive evidence, not in terms of policy, things that will actually work and be effective. And I was thinking on meritocracy. So if you analyze Singapore, like maybe it's not a democracy in the sense that they have a lot of civil rights, there's a lot of government intervention into daily activities. But something that Singapore managed to do properly, at least the way I see it, they managed to create a system that allows people to access to power based on merit, based on their abilities. Actually, they create a really, really professional civil servant system. So I was wondering if the right question or the right emphasis right now, from now on, is not democracy as much as emphasizing meritocratic societies. So I was wondering what's your insight on that, if you think these two countries we're analyzing are meritocratic, and how can we become more meritocratic societies?
You've asked a number of questions. Let me start with the big issue, which we thought a lot about and is made clear in the document. We are not arguing the only way to develop and include the poor, and grow a society is through democracy. You can't say that. It's wrong. So we're in a competitive environment. What we are saying is we don't think you have to give up democracy in order to get results and have development and inclusion and poverty alleviation. It might look like a lesser claim, but it's actually a big claim. So that's the first thing. We're not saying that's the only way you can do this. I think the issue of meritocracy is a very important issue, which is why I feel so angry about South Africa's failure, Brazil's failure, and India's to give people really good education. We're all the same. You know, people talk, the politicians talk a big game about equality and all this rubbish, in my view. They have not fixed education for the vast majority of the population. And that is very important. Now, one of the issues about positive discrimination or affirmative action or whatever you want to call it is you're saying other issues than merit should be biased and should come into the equation on who's appointed to which position. And I think looking at the experience of most countries, I would tend to oppose it. India is complicated, but certainly in South Africa, I'm opposed to this. I think this is a terrible. The unintended consequences of this are so bad that I don't support this. I think it's very hard to generalize from Singapore. Singapore is a very small city-state. You had this leader who achieved amazing things. Fabulous, well done, agreed. Is this generalizable elsewhere? Well, Rwanda and Ethiopia keep telling us we're going to do it. The head of Rwanda is now killing people in his opposition in South Africa and in Rwanda, and he's locking up people. And it's hard, we're starting to see not the Singapore story, but moving towards a more worrying story. He has achieved some things as well. These are small places, don't forget. Ethiopia makes no pretense of being a democracy whatsoever. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Yes, they are making progress in an authoritarian system. How long? What happens? I don't know. So I think it's hard to generalize from Singapore. I think it's also incredibly difficult to generalize about China. So the fact that they exist is very important. It's competition for democracy. This is true. But as I said at the beginning, I think most authoritarian states end in bloodshed and worse. So you need to think about the costs of this. We cannot order up a Lee Kuan Yew sort of easily. The remarkable thing about China, from what we understand, the closed system, is the way in which they have trained an elite that is meritocratic within some constraints. You have to be a party member, you have to dye your hair black and be male and a whole lot of other things, but they are competent. Certainly that's what it appears. How long that lasts and so on. So you do, but this is centuries of a Mandarin culture. Read Fukuyama's book, he tries to explain some of this. Replicated countries. And it's enormous human costs. So, and no society is completely meritocratic. I'm in favor of this as an ideal. And one of South Africa's problems is we're appointing people to run very complicated institutions who don't know how to run them. So merit is very important, but we have to start with education as well. So I'm in favor of this. I don't think it's got anything to do with democracy or sort of authoritarian states. Most authoritarian states, they appoint their brother and their cousin and their wife, and look at Angola and all these places. And who knows what's going on inside these societies? Because there is no free press. So it might look okay. I think one of the things is authoritarian states often look good and collapse very fast. Democracies look messy and chaotic and what's going on, but there are some inner strengths, and I would be advocating strengthening those institutional strengths and values. So I think it's a more complicated set of issues.
Can I say one thing? Well, I think as social scientists, and I certainly put myself in that category, we are not doing a really good job, though, of answering the question that people like management consultants, and I was a management consultant for many years, are forced to deal with, which is how do you build more robust and capable institutions to thrive in competitive markets? The clients that went to McKinsey to ask that question were dealing with the reality that somebody was eating their lunch and they felt threatened. And we don't have that same incentive structure coming through with an equally strong message, either to the political parties or the governmental institutions in the societies that we build. And if we don't build those strong rules-based institutions that are able to replicate themselves over time, they're very subject to corruption, very easily captured, very weak at the time that we require them most, and very unlikely to develop meritocratic capabilities that are replicable over time. I think we have a real weakness in the social sciences in that dimension. And I would argue that all the societies that we've touched on today have that as a common denominator. We are not doing a good job of answering the question, how do I manage for durability and for excellence? I actually am bored by business school types, but they really are looking at a very essential part of the fabric of successful societies, and perhaps we owe it to our discipline to contribute more to that question, because we're not going to build successful societies without successful, durable institutions.
Isn't one, I agree with the question and the point you're making, but isn't one of the ways forward to look much more carefully at which institutions have to be inside the state, which can be next to the state, run with more private sector sort of incentives, and which could be run by the private sector? I think I'm not a libertarian. I believe in an effective state. I think developing countries need effective states, but I am in favor of thinking hard in each sector as to what should be run by the state, what should be run by the private sector, and maybe you can have competition within that. So I think that's the way to think about this more creatively and more assertively than it's happening in my country.
I like this phrase you said some minutes ago, that inequality isn't as important as taking people out of poverty, because that means giving them the ways to do the rest for themselves. So I was thinking of this third thing you said, that we sometimes authoritarian states look really well from the outside, but we really know how they are really working inside in terms of taking people out of poverty. So for the general argument you were making that we don't really know democracy is the best way for delivering, how are we really able to compare democracy to authoritarian systems in terms of taking people out of poverty if we're not sometimes really able to see how they're working on the inside, because there's a lot of times enclosed systems that don't really take out much economic development information. So what are your thoughts about that? Isn't there a reserve, in your general argument about democracy versus authoritarianism, in terms of, we're not really able to see how they are working?
Look, I think we decided in this project that there was a lot of literature on the democracy advantage. In fact, there's a book on exactly that topic where they try and take all the evidence across the world, and they say, they try and prove conclusively that democracies in general are better. That wasn't the focus of our project. So you can look at literature. I'm not an expert on that literature. I think it's in general truth, but I think the second point is authoritarian states, I never trust the information. I lived in one for a long time, and people would hold forth on what Black South Africans believe or want, and generally, if you came along in an authoritarian state and asked somebody who was not part of the power elite, what do you want? What do you think? Do you like the government? Oh yeah, yes, because there's the secret police are watching you. So, and people think, even if they aren't watching, you're going to say whatever you think is okay. So I think unless you've got open debate, I mean, that's what peer review is all about, that's what the media is all about, that's what transparency is about. Unless you have these institutions and processes, I don't know what the facts are of what's going on in China. You know, so, or in other sort of authoritarian states. Now you can see we know a lot of development has taken place. We know a lot of people have urbanized. We know there are a lot of people with jobs and opportunities they didn't have before. But how much and how many and the specificities of all this, I think there are lots of questions about who reviews the official data. So I think authoritarian states, I'm very skeptical about information coming out of those countries. And the World Bank might tell you, but the World Bank has as a client the government. The World Bank is not notorious for taking controversial positions. So I think one has to be very, very careful about information coming out of closed societies. Might be right, but we don't actually know.
Well, for that very reason, we didn't include Cuba in our comparative index. We couldn't. Simply the data was not reliable.
Argentina? I may ask one question. I'm sorry for being late. The president of Finland is here, so I have to attend that.
Deputy General Director.
And we're having dinner tonight. President Juarez, Mexican president in the 1860s, when he kicked out the French, said that for my enemies I give grace and the law, and for my friends grace and the law, and for my enemies just law. And I was, as we probably covered this already, democracy creates incentives for states not to punish certain conducts. We have a lot of issues with criminality here, a lot of issues with taxation, and probably we are not harder on people who want to get out of this loop of power of the state because of democracy, because it's not good for the voting. So that's why I could be interested.
Look, as I said, I'm a believer in the rule of law and equality before the law. And in South African audiences, I like to tell the story of last year, actually, the president's lawyers, my expense, are trying to prevent giving some evidence to a very complicated case on whether or not he should be tried for fraud. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court of South Africa, at great expense, and the justices of the Supreme Court, black and white, are reported to say the following to the president's lawyer: "You don't have a case, do you?" "No," he says. "Well, then why are you wasting our time?" "Sorry, then you lost the case." Now, I think that's a very important symbol of equality before the law. And that battle is ongoing in my society, and the courts so far are holding firm. So I think the tendency for crony capitalism is very tempting in any society, not just democracy. And that's why I think equality before the law and tight laws and application of those laws are absolutely vital. So if criminals don't believe they're going to get caught, or I can do a deal with the president's family, this is corrosive of the whole society. But I think it can happen in both democracies and authoritarian states. It does happen. I think where democracies, full democracies, that have all the institutions of democracy give you an advantage, no guarantees, an advantage, is because because you have many institutions, so say Parliament is weak for a whole lot of reasons, Well, we can use the judicial system. We could use the media. We could use other ways. We can go out on the streets in peaceful protest. We can use many of the mechanisms that democracy offers us to publicize and then fight the unfairness. So I think you have an advantage in democracy. Do you use it? Can it be taken away? Of course it can. But I would argue democracies have more advantages to prevent what you're talking about than authoritarian systems.
And having been the host, I'm taking the privilege of the last question. We do believe in cooperation and international cooperation with other organizations. Actually, we just signed an agreement with Jaharana, which is the Indian organization that launched I Pay the Bribe. So we are using the I Pay the Bribe Indian model to launch it in Mexico somewhere in summer or early autumn. We already have everything set. We just are too busy finishing all of the talks on our pipeline. And speaking of all these things of the importance of democracy, just over this weekend, something happened that affects colleagues of us in Russia. When President Putin declared that civil society organizations and think tanks could be dangerous for the Russian state. So people that do work like us in Russia are seeing their freedom, their property. They will have to pay certain expenses to a special tax to the government for the fact of doing the work that we do in South Africa, Mexico. So we should treasure and value democracy, not just in a conceptual way, more in a practical and everyday, because it has to do a lot with our life goals. Engaging in this spirit of cooperation, there's a lot of literature on the democracy advantage, but I haven't seen that much on the authoritarian disadvantage. I'm so bored in a way, but the people give an example of Lee Kuan Yew now that he passed away, or here in Latin America mentioning Pinochet as the role model, that authoritarianism is the base for economic growth. And people see Lee Kuan Yew, China, and Pinochet about the Mobutu Sesecos, the Robert Mugabes, the Videlas, if you have like all the statistical evidence of what authoritarianism has made to economic growth, prosperity, poverty, and you just compare it, maybe demographically you have a problem with China because there's too much people there. But if you take all these dozens of cases, for every Lee Kuan Yew, you have 50 failures of authoritarian governments. And I see very little research on that. If you want to endeavor in this conversation, maybe I would love to think of having this work together. And just for a closing question, we talked a lot about democracy, but we didn't talk a lot about markets. Which would be the key points, the bullet points, how to sell to an skeptical society, an skeptical public, the fact that successful businesses are public goods beyond social corporate responsibility, just by itself, like a company that creates profits and creates jobs. It's something we should treasure and protect as a good for society and a good for economy.
Yeah. Well, I would love to do a project on the authoritarian disadvantage. I think it's a great idea. We should talk about it some more. Let me, I've written a book on, in a sense, business and its very overwhelmingly positive contribution to developing countries. And I think one has to think about this in two different ways. So one is, let's call it the direct benefits of having a successful modern company. We could list them. Most companies can't list them. We should, so, I don't know, Walmart, how many people they employ, what training they offer, healthcare, pensions, all the things you could quantify. Let's call those direct, things that are discussed at the board and we could quantify them. Taxes they pay to whichever level of government.
I'm a member of the board of Walmart.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. company I don't know much about.
Low prices every day.
No, that's what I'm coming to. So let's call it that direct benefit of the company. Then, again, we don't have the right language. I called it the sort of invisible corporate citizenship or indirect benefits of the existence of a company. Indirect, everyday low prices. Some people have calculated how this has reduced inflation in America by 1 to 2%. So this is not what the company intends to do. It's not, what the board says, well, we're going to build another Walmart and reduce inflation in South Africa. No, these are indirect, unintended consequences of having successful modern business. And I think we know too little about this and it's under research. So it ranges from reducing inflation to opening up opportunities for women or other minority groups or majority groups. Take a tribe in Africa, just hierarchically organized, a mining company arrives. They don't really care about all of this, they just want labor. Well, suddenly the idea of a career, I could have a career, the individualism. What I do in this company affects my chances of going up. In South Africa, during apartheid, companies became almost independent spaces. They were promoting Black South Africans because they needed to. These are not do-gooding organizations. They needed Black labor. They trained Black labor. Then the government came along and said, oh, all Black people are interchangeable. Those people must go back to the rural areas. We'll give you some others. No. Not what we want. We've trained these people. They're now managing processes. So in an odd way, you've got companies going ahead of the country in terms of how they treated Black South Africans. So there are a whole lot of examples I could give. I could go on and on about this. In fact, I'm talking about this on Wednesday at an event in Africa Week with the Department of Foreign Affairs, but I'm going to be talking about the role of business. And I think most chief executives, with very few exceptions, they're ruthless competitors in the marketplace. Some are colluding capitalists, but ruthless competitors in the marketplace. You put them in front of a microphone and you ask them about society or poverty, and they say, oh, markets don't work, and they become socialists. I think there's been an intellectual collapse of like the business elite, business schools, and all sorts of people on how to defend the enormous positive benefits of capitalism. And that needs a lot more thought. This could be another area I would love to sort of talk about and see if we could collaborate. I think you need to develop this, let's call it the indirect benefits of successful modern companies much more. It really needs more research, we need to understand more, we need more data and metrics. But if you think of any big company, I was talking to one of South Africa's big banks, and I said, everyone attacks you all the time. Why don't you talk about, you can advertise, you think about it, modern companies can persuade me of needs I don't even know I have or probably don't need at all, and I'll go out and buy something. And yet these phenomenal marketing machines are not used in any way to promote the role of business and capitalism in the wider society and politics. And this is a big failure, in my view. Now, businessmen say, oh, I'm not a politician, but politics is coming after you. So you need, they don't have to do it, they just need to put up resources and understand the issues of you have to sell the enormous benefits of capitalism for ordinary people and voters much more effectively than we do. And instead of businesses funding, oh, we'll fund the university and indirectly they're funding left-wing professors, they should actually be thinking much more strategically about when to put their money and resources and time and kind of not get onto other people's agendas. Yeah, I could go on and on. This is a topic I'm really interested in. But I think there's a lot to think about for organizations like yourselves and us. This is a very big issue, and it matters. for everything we're talking about, because unless you sell this more effectively, the case for market reform is harder to make. And the politicians are less likely to be effective at making it if we're not giving them the data.
I really need a copy of it.
With pleasure. We'll give you one tonight if that's helpful.
And thank you very much for this fest of ideas.
Cheated, but I didn't learn more about Mexico. You made me talk too much.
Actually, you were.
You didn't tell us enough about.
I'll break it.
Thank you. Okay.
Everything you talked about is germane. So that gives you already a PhD on Mexico.
Sometimes you use the word South Africa, this and that, and I felt like if we put Mexico in the sentence, it will fit perfectly.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot to learn between the two countries, and we should think about how to do that. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.